is our seated cervical flexion passive stretch leading into our cervical flexion with PAILs and rails contractions. So there's 3 components to the stretch, beginning with the passive component being our 2 minutes of diaphragmatic breathing while holding the stretch passively. Our second component is going to be our PAILs component. Our PAILs component is going to be us driving into our own hands, trying to resist extension, and nothing is actually going to be changing. Our rails component will be following our PAILs component. So for our rails component, we're going to be actively trying to pull ourselves further down into cervical flexion. So for setup here, we're going to start with our passive stretch, feet flat on the ground, nice upright torso. We're going to actively pull ourselves down into as much cervical flexion as we have access to while keeping our height in our spine. We're going to pull ourselves down, find our active range of motion. Then from here, we're going to add some downward pressure with our hands behind our head. Casually trying to pull ourselves deeper into the stretch with just light pressure and not cranking or yanking your spine. So we're here, hands behind the head. We would do our 2 minutes of breathing here, trying to relax into the stretch and trying to elongate and relax the backside muscles of the cervical spine. After you're done with your passive component of the stretch, after 2 minutes, then we would proceed with our PAILs contraction and our rails contractions. So starting with our PAILs contraction, we're going to resist extension by driving into our own hands for 10 to 15 seconds while doing our breathing. Now for our rails contraction, we're going to try and move away from our own hands, pulling ourselves deeper into cervical flexion. Holding for 10 to 15 seconds before going back into my PAILs contraction. Now again, I'm driving back into extension, into my own hands, really trying to contract. Back into my rails contraction, chin down. You're going to repeat for the prescribed amount of reps there. So always starting with our passive stretch, nice light pressure into cervical flexion, trying to elongate the muscles on the backside of the cervical spine. Following your passive stretch, then you're going to move into your PAILs and rails contractions, which are both going to be 10 to 15 seconds, or whatever the prescribed time is for you. And you're going to transition back and forth between your PAILs and rails for the prescribed amount of reps. That is your seated cervical flexion passive stretch, leading into your cervical flexion with PAILs and rails contractions.